The real reason Britain lost Suez, the financial crisis behind an empire. At first glance, the Suez Crisis looks like a military story. July 26, 1956. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal Company. 3 months later, Israel attacks Egypt. Britain and France intervene. Their aircraft bomb Egyptian targets, and troops land near Port Said. For a brief moment, the old imperial powers appear to be winning. Then everything collapses. The troops stop, the governments retreat. Anthony Eden's premiership is destroyed, and Britain discovers something more important than the fact that Nasser could resist an invasion. Britain could no longer wage a major war without the financial cooperation of the United States. The usual story is that Britain lost because America opposed the invasion. That is true. Washington did not need to defeat the British Army or destroy the Royal Navy. It had something far more powerful, dollars, and Britain needed them. Suez was therefore not simply the moment when Britain's military power failed. It was the moment when Britain discovered that its military power depended on a financial system it no longer controlled. So how had Britain, only 11 years after helping defeat Nazi Germany, reached this position? The answer begins with the economic wreckage of the Second World War. Britain had won the war, but victory had left the country financially exhausted. It had borrowed heavily, accumulated obligations, sold overseas assets, and depended on American assistance. Yet Britain still possessed an empire, a global navy, overseas bases, and a currency used throughout international trade. The problem was simple. Britain still had the responsibilities of a great power, but increasingly lacked the money to pay for them. An empire is not maintained by flags. It is maintained by the ability to pay for ships, soldiers, bases, fuel, imports, and credit. And Britain increasingly depended on a monetary system in which the most important reserve currency was not sterling. It was the American dollar. In 1945, Britain negotiated a $3.75 billion American loan. But Britain also carried enormous overseas sterling liabilities. By the end of 1945, these were roughly £3.6 billion, with more than £2.3 billion held by overseas sterling countries. These were claims on Britain's financial system. Britain wanted to rebuild its economy, maintain employment, defend its global commitments, preserve sterling, and maintain its fixed relationship with the dollar. All of this required something Britain could not simply create: foreign currency. Britain could create pounds, it could not create dollars. In 1947, Britain attempted to make sterling convertible into dollars. The experiment lasted only weeks. Capital flowed out, reserves fell, and Britain suspended convertibility. The warning was clear. Britain could maintain its global commitments only while its external finances remained manageable. By the 1950s, Britain still behaved like a great power. Its finances increasingly behaved like those of a country that had to watch its reserves carefully. And this is where Suez becomes more complicated than a story of imperial arrogance. Britain had genuine interests in the Middle East. Oil mattered. The canal mattered. Military bases and communications mattered. British officials also feared that Arab nationalism could destroy Britain's remaining influence. But maintaining that strategy was increasingly difficult because of Britain's balance of payments problem. Britain needed foreign currency to pay for imports. If it spent more than it earned, it had to borrow, use reserves, or cut spending. Yet foreign policy itself consumed enormous resources. Britain wanted to remain a global military power while rebuilding its domestic economy. Those objectives increasingly conflicted. The key question was therefore not simply, why was Britain weak? It was, why did Britain continue making great power commitments after the financial conditions supporting them had changed? The most difficult commitment was the Middle East. The Suez Canal shortened the route between Europe and Asia and was deeply connected to Middle Eastern oil, shipping, and sterling. Arab countries also held substantial sterling assets. This meant that political instability could quickly become a monetary problem. A crisis could undermine confidence in sterling. That could increase demand for dollars. And Britain might then be forced to defend the pound with its limited reserves. This is why Nasser's rise mattered so much. Gamal Abdel Nasser represented a movement increasingly hostile to the old colonial order. The Suez Canal zone symbolized Britain's unresolved influence in Egypt. Nasser also understood the economics. Egypt wanted to finance the Aswan High Dam. In 1956, negotiations over Western financing collapsed. Britain and the United States withdrew their support. Nasser now needed another source of revenue and political leverage. On July 26, 1956, he announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. It was more than the seizure of a waterway. It was a declaration that Egypt intended to control an institution long associated with European power. Britain and France saw it as a direct challenge. Anthony Eden feared that allowing Nasser to succeed could weaken British influence throughout the Middle East and threaten Western oil supplies. But beneath the strategy was a dangerous assumption. Britain still believed it possessed the freedom of action of an independent great power. That assumption was about to be tested. Diplomacy came first, but Britain and France increasingly considered military action. Then came the secret agreement with Israel. Israel would attack Egypt. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum and intervene, supposedly to separate the combatants and protect the canal. The plan depended on secrecy, and on the assumption that the United States would tolerate it. That assumption was wrong. On October 29th, Israel invaded Sinai. Britain and France issued their ultimatum. Then Anglo-French forces attacked. Militarily, the operation initially looked successful, but there was another battlefield: the currency market. Within days, pressure on sterling intensified. The pound was fixed at $2.80. Britain did not want to devalue, so the Bank of England defended the currency. And defending a currency under pressure requires reserves: dollars, gold, foreign exchange. As the crisis intensified, Britain's reserves fell heavily. The feedback loop was brutal. Military intervention increased uncertainty. Uncertainty increased pressure on sterling. Pressure on sterling caused reserve losses. Reserve losses reduced Britain's ability to continue the operation. The empire was beginning to fight itself through its own balance sheet. Then came oil. The canal was blocked, while pipelines associated with the Iraq Petroleum Company were disrupted. Western Europe faced serious supply problems. Britain now had two connected crises. It needed foreign currency to defend sterling, and it needed oil to keep its economy functioning. Much of that oil had to be paid for in currencies Britain did not control. The more the crisis disrupted trade, the greater the pressure on Britain's external finances. This is why the financial crisis behind Suez is more than a metaphor. Finance was becoming an instrument of foreign policy, and the United States possessed the leverage Britain lacked. Washington controlled enormous financial resources and occupied a central position in the post-war monetary system. Britain had reserves, but they were limited. That distinction would decide the crisis. President Eisenhower opposed the invasion for several reasons. He did not want the United States associated with European colonialism. He feared Soviet influence in the Middle East, and the timing was disastrous. While Britain and France attacked Egypt, the Soviet Union was crushing the Hungarian uprising. Washington could hardly condemn Soviet intervention in Hungary while appearing to support an Anglo-French attack on Egypt. Britain believed it was defending Western interests. Eisenhower believed the invasion could damage those interests. And beneath the diplomatic conflict was the financial reality. Britain could not easily continue without American cooperation. On November 5th, British and French forces were advancing. On November 6th, the ceasefire came. The military operations stopped. The political explanation was diplomatic pressure. The financial mechanism was more severe. Britain was running out of room. British officials sought international financial assistance, and the IMF became part of the emergency discussions. The exact mechanics are more complicated than the simple claim that America vetoed an IMF loan. Broader reality is clear. Britain needed external financial support.